Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today for our webinar on the E-2 visa. My name is Dustin Saldarriaga, and I'm a Senior Associate with Scott Legal PC. Today, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking about the E-2 Treaty Investor Visa, which is one of the most popular visas that our firm handles. And for good reason. Our firm was actually founded on an E-2 visa by Ian Scott. And we're very fortunate to have Ian with us today to be presenting the second half of this webinar, which will focus on some particularly risky and challenging E-2 businesses to start in the US. But the E-2 visa really is an ideal option for nationals of treaty countries who want to start or develop a business in the United States. So a few things before we get started on this presentation. The first is that this webinar is part of a series of webinars that we do. We try to do at least 2 webinars a month, and typically we do many more than that. And these cover a broad range of US immigration topics. Though our firm does focus on business immigration, we handle family immigration, humanitarian immigration. So really any questions you have about immigration, we hope you will reach out to us. And our webinars reflect that. So after this presentation, you will be getting an email with a link where you can sign up for our future webinars. You'll also be receiving a comprehensive guide to the E-2 visa that we prepared, as well as a link to our YouTube channel. We post our webinars to our YouTube channel as well as shorter videos. And again, those run the full spectrum of immigration topics. So do check that out. And this webinar will be recorded, as I mentioned, will be posted to our YouTube channel. If you have a question during the presentation, please feel free to send that in by using either the chat function on Zoom or the Q&A function, and we will be monitoring that throughout the presentation. We plan to get through all the questions by the end of the presentation, and we'll either answer questions when they come in if they're relevant to what we're talking about at the moment, or we'll save them for the end. But either way, we do plan to get through all of the questions that are asked, so don't hesitate to send those in. All right, again, my name is Dustin. We will be hearing from Ian for the second half of the presentation. To get us started, why don't we go ahead and dive in by talking about the requirements for the E-2 Treaty Investor Visa. The first requirement, as the name suggests, is that you must be a national of a treaty country, an E-2 treaty country. And fortunately, there are dozens of E-2 treaty countries. I think at last count, there were more than 80. And they really do span the globe. Latin America, Canada, Mexico, Europe, Africa, Asia, the Middle East. So it's worth, if you are curious about an E-2 visa, just Google E-2 treaty countries and you'll see a list of the countries. You only need to have a passport. We'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. You don't need to have been born in an E-2 treaty country. You only need to hold a passport to be counted as a national of a treaty country. You must own at least 50% of the E-2 company in order to qualify as an E-2 investor. So you can have 2 owners who each own 50-50 of the company, but you do need to at least own 50% of the company. The other owner really can be anybody. They can be a US citizen, they can be a green card holder, another E-2 treaty national, or it could be a combination of people. You could own 50%, and then the remaining 50% are owned by thousands of people. But you do need to own at least 50% of the E-2 company. You need to make a substantial investment in the E-2 company. Now, what is defined as substantial? It depends on the type of company. We'll talk about that in a later slide. But the point being, the government will want to see that you have committed your personal funds to the E-2 company, both to show that you are committed to the company, as well as you have bought everything that's needed for the company to become operational. And we'll talk about that requirement in a couple minutes. Now, you will need to have documentation showing exactly where the money you invested in the E-2 company came from. The requirement is actually a quite low one. You do need to just show the government that the funds are from a legal source. The funds can also not be secured by the E2 company. They can be secured through a loan as long as they're secured by your personal assets. They just can't be secured by the E2 company. But as long as the funds were received legally, and as long as the funds are not based on a loan that's secured by the E2 company, most other sources of funds are perfectly fine, including gifts, including selling a property, an inheritance. All of these are very typical sources of income and usually don't raise a problem. Now, what would you typically spend this money on? What you want to think about is, and we'll talk about a bit more about this in a later slide, but really you want to think about what the company needs to become operational. What are all the things you need to buy for the company to be operational? If you're starting a consulting firm or a law firm, you want to show you have office space, you want to show you have office furniture, a dedicated space for the business, computers, any insurance. You may be employing workers, one worker part-time. You might have a contractor. These are all perfectly fine and good E2 expenditures. We'll talk a bit later about what are not considered good expenditures, but broadly speaking, really anything that's needed for the business to become operational is generally a good expense. The fourth requirement for an E2 visa that you see on the screen is that the business actually needs to employ US workers. The rule of thumb that we use is that you need to employ at least 3 full-time US workers within 5 years of the business getting started. And this is referred to the business not being marginal. So that's a term used in the regulations. It's not a common term outside of the E2 visa, but really the marginality requirement is that the business needs to employ US workers. This is a key requirement to keep in mind, especially given the nature of this presentation. This presentation is focused on applications, E2 applications with low investment amounts or otherwise risky applications. When you're talking about E2 visa applications with low investment or that are otherwise risky, you want to strengthen the application in other ways. And one of the key ways to do that is to show that you already employ US workers. If you're able to show the government that you already employ US workers, oftentimes other aspects of the application are not as important. For example, if you have a low investment amount, it's not as important if you can show the government you already employ US workers, you already have a business that's operational. So keep that requirement in mind, the requirement to employ US workers. Consular officers are usually looking at applications to be convinced that this is a business that will actually employ US workers. So that's a key requirement. The fifth requirement you see on your screen is that the business must be real and operating. And I referred to this before when talking about the investment. You want to spend money on the things that are needed for the business to be operational. The way I like to think about this requirement is when you are in your visa interview at the consulate, the officer, if they ask you, what do you need for the business to become operational? You want to be able to say that the only thing you need is a visa. And as soon as that visa is granted, you're going to buy your flight, you're going to get on the plane, you're going to come to the US, and you're going to be able to begin operating the business. That you have the office space lined up, you have insurance lined up, you have any licenses you need. If you need a worker, that person's lined up. If you are selling any products, though the inventory is purchased and is waiting for you to arrive. So that's the way to think about the real and operating requirement. In contrast, the E2 visa is not intended for you to come to the US and start looking for opportunities. So to do that, you would need a B1 visa, or you could come to the US on ESTA, the visa waiver program, if you're eligible. The B1 or ESTA, that's perfectly fine to come to the US, meet with business brokers, meet with people who are selling a business, or open a commercial bank account, find an office space, look for a business to start. That's for the B1 or ESTA. That's not for the E-2. The E-2, you want to have all those things lined up and be ready to hit the ground running when you arrive on your E-2 visa. Ways you would show that in your application. You see a few examples on your screen. We would typically include in applications a signed lease showing that you have office space. We'd show proof that the LLC, that the US business exists, whether it's an LLC or a corporation, for example, that there's a website for the company, that it's already marketing its services or products, that there are contracts with customers, or at least letters of intent showing that customers are interested in the business and ready to buy. And if you have a business that requires licenses, such as a restaurant that requires a health department license, or, Ian is going to talk a little later about equity companies. Those require licenses to trade, to sell securities, for example. You want to have all of that lined up before you are sitting in your visa interview, and ideally before you even submit the application. The sixth requirement you see on your screen is that you need to be coming to the US on the E-2 visa solely to develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. So there are a few pieces to this. One is that your work authorization when you come to the US is limited to working for the E-2 company. So you can't come to the US on an E-2 and then work at Starbucks or get a side job or start a separate business. All of that, any work activities that you plan to do on an E-2 visa need to be defined in the E-2 application. You need to be disclosing that to the consulate, and they need to approve it before you do it. So if you're starting a business and you think you might get into another branch or selling a slightly different product or providing a different service, you want to define that in the E-2 application at the start. It is possible to expand after you get to the US. It's a little trickier, a little outside the scope of this presentation, but if that question comes up, feel free to reach out to us to discuss further. The other aspect of this requirement is that you do need to show in your application that you have background that qualifies you to do what you plan to do. We would usually include a resume in the application, in the business plan, which we'll talk about a little bit more. You do want to talk about how you are the ideal person to run this business, to develop and direct the business. But the bar for that is actually quite low. So don't be the one to decide that you're not qualified. I would say instead, if you're thinking about starting a business in the US, reach out. Let's talk about that. Even if you've never run a convenience store, but you want to start one in the US, we've seen that many times be a successful thing to do. So it is an opportunity to really advocate for yourself and explain how, even though you've never run a convenience store, for example, how you do have experience, in other jobs or maybe through your education that qualifies you to do that. And the last thing I'll say about this sixth requirement to develop and direct the E-2 company is that if you are applying from within the United States, you would be applying through USCIS. If you plan not to go to a consulate for the visa, but instead to apply within the US for E-2 status, we'll talk about those two options later in the presentation. But USCIS, for applications filed within the US, they are very strict that your role in the United States as an E-2 treaty investor should really be running the business. You should not be providing services directly to clients. So to take an example, if you are starting, say, an accounting company, and again, you're applying through USCIS, let's say you have gone through accounting, you've got your accounting degree in the US as an F1 student, and you want to change to E-2, you need to show that you are going to be hiring an accountant to provide those services to clients, that you are not going to be the one accountant working for this company, because then the government will think you're actually competing with other accountants in the US. In contrast, a business owner or an entrepreneur doesn't compete with other entrepreneurs or business owners. They create business, they create opportunities, they create jobs. They don't compete for them. So you need to be framing yourself as the business owner, as the entrepreneur who's going to hire the accountant rather than being the accountant yourself. So again, that's USCIS. You want to show if you are applying through USCIS, you're going to hire workers early on in the process who are going to provide those services, and you will be the one developing and directing the E-2 company. And the final requirement you see on your screen is that you need to have the intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of the E-2 visa. The E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa. It is not a green card. It is not an immigrant visa. And that means you need to show the government you intend to leave the US at the end of the visa. That being said, it is fine to renew your visa. It is fine to extend your status within the US as long as you remain eligible. What's important though is that you cannot use an E-2 to pursue a green card. You can't have the intention to use the E-2 to pursue a green card when you're applying for the visa or when you're entering the US on the visa. And it's usually quite easy to show this. We would include in our applications a signed statement by the applicant that says that at the end of my visa status, I do intend to return to my home country. So let's dig a little bit deeper into these requirements. Who can apply for an E-2 visa and how long does it last? As I mentioned before, the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa that allows nationals of E-2 treaty countries to come to the US to develop and direct a US company in which they have invested. That one statement, that one bullet kind of captures a number of the requirements we talked about before. It talks about nationality. It talks about the develop and direct requirement. It talks about the investment requirement and the intention to depart. It's not an immigrant visa, it's a non-immigrant visa. But let's talk a little bit more about the nationality requirement. So you do need to hold a passport from an E-2 treaty country. As I said before, you only need to have the passport. So you don't need to have been born in an E-2 treaty country. You don't need to actually have even been to an E-2 treaty country. We have seen applications, say someone who lives in Uruguay, which is not an E-2 treaty country, but they have Italian citizenship through a parent, for example. If they have an Italian passport, even if they've never been to Italy, Italy is an E-2 treaty country, so they would be able to apply simply based on that Italian passport, and that is permissible. Now, in the past, you could acquire E-2 nationality through investment, say through Grenada was a very common choice where someone, say from India or China, those are not E-2 treaty countries, could invest in Grenada, receive a passport from Grenada after they receive citizenship, and could immediately apply for an E-2 visa. That's no longer the case. Now you need to actually have lived in that country where you've acquired E-2 citizenship. So in that example, it would be Grenada. You need to have lived there for 3 years before you apply for the E-2 visa based on that nationality. So if you are from a country that is not an E-2 country, just to name a few, Brazil, China, India, South Africa, these are not E-2 treaty countries. The door is still open to get E-2 country nationality. You can still get E-2 country nationality through investment, but there is the additional requirement that you actually need to live in Grenada or another E-2 treaty country for that you have citizenship through for at least 3 years. So that is a big additional obligation if you plan to apply through investment for an E-2 visa. Now, there are a number of options for obtaining an E-2 visa. You can purchase an existing business. You can work through a business broker. Oftentimes there are, say, restaurants up for sale, convenience stores up for sale, and you can apply that way. If you're doing that, you want to make sure that the business employs at least 3 people, ideally, so that you don't have to then prove to the government that you will employ 3 people. A second option, you can start a business in the US. Both of these are very common, purchasing a business or starting a business. If you're starting a business, you want to show many of the things we talked about before, that you've purchased everything that the business needs and it really is ready to be operational once you get your visa. A third way that people pursue an E-2 visa is through a franchise. That's very common. And a franchise can be a great option because they tend to be recognizable. The government has heard of, Firehouse subs, Subway sandwiches, things like this. So there is a track record where, you're not doing a startup where, there is some risk involved. A franchise, there's a little less risk because you have the franchise supporting you, helping with marketing, etc. Now, that being said, starting a business is a very common path. We handle these cases all the time. So those are certainly viable options as long as the requirements are met. I already talked about the treaty requirement. And so how long is the E2 visa valid for? The span is 3 months to 5 years, and that depends on something called reciprocity. Basically, when there is an E2 visa, the other country, say, New Zealand or Canada or the UK, will also offer US citizens a similar visa. And when the time limit is applied on one side, there is reciprocity on the other. So what you want to do is you can Google US Department of State reciprocity, and you can click on your country of nationality. Again, that's the passport you're applying on, and you'll see how long the E2 visa can be granted for. So it's a maximum of 5 years, a minimum of 3 months. That would apply to, say, Bangladesh. And it really is dependent on the nationality. Now, the consular officer can limit your validity period. So let's say you're applying with a startup. The officer thinks it's a risky startup, so they're going to give you the visa for a limited period of time, and then you can come back and renew the visa. That does happen sometimes. So even though, say, Canadians can be granted an E2 visa for 5 years, sometimes the consulate will issue it for 3 years and will want you to come back and show how the business is doing, and then they'll renew the visa if they see it's doing well, for example. A very common question we receive is how much investment is enough? So if you remember, one of the key requirements for an E2 visa is you need to actually commit your personal funds to the business. What does that mean, to commit your funds? Well, it needs to be more than simply transferring your funds to a business bank account. The funds actually need to be spent. So when you submit your application, what we do is we include invoices showing, for example, that the applicant has actually purchased inventory, that they've actually paid for office space. You also want to include proof of those funds being committed. So not just an invoice, but also your business bank account statement showing that the funds have actually left that account. So there's risk involved here, and that's an important part of these applications. The consulate wants to see that you really have put your personal funds on the line. You're serious about the business, and at the same time that you've bought all the things that the business needs to become operational. But how much is enough? The government doesn't provide a set dollar amount. There are examples in the green card context, like the EB-5, where they say if you invest $800,000, you qualify based on the investment. That's not the case for an E2. Now, there are pros and cons to this. The con is that there's an amount of uncertainty. You could show up to your visa interview and have an officer who wants to see more money. Also, certain consulates do tend to see E2 applications from larger businesses. And so one of the services that we provide is to work with clients to be strategic about whether their consulate that they're applying to requires a higher investment amount, or if they're more flexible, the consulate is more flexible. USCIS tends to allow a lower investment amount. But there is some ambiguity there since the government does not publish a set dollar amount. Instead, the amount depends, and this is the positive, it depends on the type of business. And it also depends on the strength of the application holistically. So the benefit is that it is possible to apply for an E2 visa with a relatively low dollar amount. Ian, who will speak later in the presentation, can share his experience where his law firm, our law firm, really was started on a relatively low dollar amount, but he was able to show that even though a low investment amount was made, everything was purchased that was needed for the business to be operational, and the business is successful, and he's able to show that in the application, which takes the spotlight off the investment amount and focuses on that employment piece and the success of the business. If your business is focused on manufacturing, something that is really capital intensive, you will need to show that you have put more money on the line. You've committed more funds. Now, fortunately, the government uses something that's called the proportionality test, which basically says that if a business requires more money to get started, the government will not expect to see 100% of those funds being committed. They may expect to see 80 or 90%. Say the investment amount is 10 million. The government might accept $8 million committed. On the other end of the spectrum, if the business is a service business that requires $50,000, $100,000 to get started, the government will want to see 100% of those funds being committed. So that is the proportionality test. The more the business costs to get started, the lower the percentage the government will expect to see actually committed to the business. But even still, you do want to, we're talking high amounts here. And given this presentation is focused on low investment amount risky cases, it is probably wise to assume that you need to commit 100% of the funds that the business needs to get started. Now, what about if you're buying a business or starting a franchise? If you're buying a business, you want to show that you're paying the fair market value for the business. This is usually not an issue unless you're buying a business from, say, a family member or a friend. If that's the case, you really do want to show that the business has been properly valued and that you really are paying the amount that anyone would be expected to pay. The government does scrutinize transactions between family members. So if you have a brother who's selling a business in the US and you are buying it, you want to be very careful to document everything and make sure it's clear that you're paying the fair market value for the business. Now, this slide is focused on kind of the core of this presentation, which is how do you deal with low dollar amounts? And I've already hinted at this, which is you want to think about the overall strength of the application and keep in mind that there are certain requirements that you can show you've really satisfied before you apply so that the investment requirement is less significant to the officer. You always need to commit your funds to the business. If you've committed no funds to the business, or if you've only moved funds to a business bank account as working capital and actually haven't spent anything, those cases are always going to have a high likelihood of denial. You need to commit some funds. But if you've committed a low amount, and when we say that, we're usually talking about under $100,000, there are other ways to strengthen the application. One of the best ways is to show that you've already hired US workers. So you might hire a part-time worker as an office manager or an independent contractor as a marketer. These are all examples of, look, even though I've invested a low amount, I'm already providing work for US workers, and that is a great way to strengthen your application. Another way is to really clearly show that the business is real and operating in spite of the low investment amount. So you want to show that you've spent enough to start generating interest from prospective clients through letters of intent, for example, or signed contracts, even better, signed contracts with clients. You can also get letters from chambers of commerce or from a certified public accountant, a CPA, talking about how the business is going to provide a service that's beneficial to the community. The Chamber of Commerce can write such a letter, or a CPA can write a letter based on their experience showing that you have invested enough to get this type of business started based on their experience. You see two examples on your screen. Really, one is talking about how someone who is able to hire that US worker. The other is not willing to hire a US worker. And that example, the second example, is going to be far more risky than the first. So we've already talked about common E-2 expenditures. Really, these are things that are required for the E-2 business. And as you read through this list, this is really just to give you an idea of what all is needed to get the business started. But you are going to be the expert on that question because you're the expert on your business. The required expenses for a convenience store are very different from the required expenses for a law firm. But what is important is that if the consular officer asks you, is there anything else the business needs to become operational? You want the answer to be no, and you want to be able to show that you've bought everything that's needed. The list on your screen is really things we would look for in pretty much every application. Obviously, some things like inventory will not be required, say, for a law firm or a consulting firm. But by and large, you want to go through this list and see, have I bought these things for my business? And is it possible to buy them before my application? Some things, if you have a low investment amount, some things you can invest more in, and it does benefit the business, such as marketing. Marketing tends to be something that you can put more money into, and it does benefit the business. You know, sometimes it's possible to pay for an office lease, pay in advance. So instead of just paying a month, maybe you can pay 6 months of your office lease in advance. That's another way to increase the investment amount. You know, we would never recommend spending money just for the sake of spending money. We always try to find opportunities to benefit the business, such as through marketing. But if you have a low investment amount, think about things like marketing. Think about things like paying for office space in advance, hiring a US worker, ways to boost the investment amount. Even before you start thinking about ways to strengthen the application elsewhere. If you can increase the investment amount, that's generally a good thing to do. So in contrast, what are some bad or weak expenditures? You see a list on your screen. Really, these are things where the consular officer will wonder if they're actually necessary for to benefit the business itself versus to benefit you as, say, the business owner, or things that are more focused on finding the business opportunity rather than building the E2 business. So travel or flights to the US. These are not good expenses. You want to leave those off the list of expenditures, which we call the investment schedule. Similarly, hotel expenses, don't include those. Meals, transportation, entertainment. Um, the one thing that does raise questions is, well, what about, say, a training course? You know, if it's closely related to the E2 business, you might be able to include a training that you undergo. But by and large, you wanna be thoughtful about you know, what you do include. For example, a law degree, you would definitely not include a law degree if you're starting a law firm. Ian didn't include his law degree, his tuition on his investment schedule. That's clearly a personal development expense. It's not specific to the business, but if you do have an expense that's specific to the business, it could be worth a discussion with a qualified immigration lawyer to see if it would count. And with that, I will go ahead and pass it off to Ian to talk about some challenges that are unique to consulting businesses.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Dustin. And yes, and I think that the challenges that are unique to consulting businesses, I've lived through them because the law firm was founded on an E2 visa, as Dustin mentioned, and these were some things that I really had to give some thought to myself. And I had a consultation just today, and the person wanted to set up a digital marketing company. And I explained to them that, I'd be the first person to say that you could spend 5,000 or maybe even less, or maybe a little bit more to get that business up and running. You don't necessarily need an office. You could use a computer, and you have a desk, and, really doesn't take a lot to get that business up and running. Dustin mentioned that the investment amount for Scott Legal was quite low. I spent $15,000, and it was a real struggle even to spend that because there just weren't things to spend money on. Now, I think that even though the investment amount that is required is very low to set up these types of businesses, unfortunately, you are going to have to spend some money. And in some cases, it might be money that as a savvy business owner, you wouldn't normally spend. So for example, when I did my E2, I signed a year lease. I was committed to a year, and the rent was $1,700 a month. And, that was not something that I needed at all. I didn't need an office. I didn't have any clients when I started. It was just an expense that really, almost described as threw money away. But it did help me get the E2 visa. Consular officers like seeing leases, and there was a committed amount. I think I paid first month and last month's rent, so that kind of increased my investment amount almost to the $4,000 mark, or increased it by $4,000. And so there is that kind of need, I think, to, even though we all know that it may not be necessary to spend a lot of money, there is that need to do that. The one exception is if you are applying through USCIS, and USCIS is willing to accept very low investment amounts. So lower investment amounts, where if you have a service-oriented business and you're able to explain that you've spent all of the money in all of the different areas to get your business up and running, then that might be sufficient to get your E-2 visa through USCIS, even if the investment amount was around the $15,000 mark. I will say that the business, my company was founded 12 years ago. And I would say that the environment was a little bit different. There was a few years after my company was founded that we continued to process E-2 visas with very low investment amounts, under $20,000. But I would say that for the most part, it seems that those days are gone. It'd be very, very difficult to get an E-2 visa approved with such a low investment amount. That being said, if you do have a low investment amount, then or you're looking at a consulting business, then you can point to other things that might strengthen your case, and one of those might be that your experience. I know that the officer who saw me liked the fact that like my educational background and my professional experience, and that was very helpful to the application. I think that Dustin mentioned some other things like getting letters of intent from clients that to demonstrate that you already have prospects. Letters of intent or even contracts can be helpful, or actually just hiring employees, right? Because the investment amount is really a proxy to show that you are ultimately going to be able to hire U.S. workers, and if you can show them that you've already hired U.S. workers, then that can be very useful. The other thing that the other thing that I think is, this does happen sometimes, is that the individual's background and how important that is, and especially if you are starting a consulting business, you do want to be able to show that you are committed to and going to be able to successfully run the operations. I remember one E-2 client that we had that these were in the days when the investment amount could be very low, but we sent the client to the consulate, and the person was starting a management consulting company, and the person had a decent educational background, MBA and other things. But when they went to the interview, the officer asked, "So tell me about your business," and the person kind of froze and really wasn't able to communicate. And I think that that may not be a problem for some businesses if you're opening up a restaurant, or if you're opening up a convenience store or something like that. Pool cleaning business, maybe that might not be a problem. But if you're opening up a management consulting business where that is your whole job, right? That's your job, is to provide advice to individuals, and the first question someone asks you is, "What do you do?" and you can't answer them, then I think that the officer is probably going to think, and as the officer did in this case, because the officer denied the application, going to think that you're not going to be able to successfully operate the business. The other thing I kind of describe to people is that when you're at the interview, think of the officer as that's what they do for a living, right? Like they see many people coming through, many service-oriented business, et cetera. And what is it that's going to set you apart from the others? Or even as basic as getting to the last thing that I just talked about, getting to basics of why is it that your business is going to be successful, right? So a lot of it is, and especially when you are providing the services, a lot of it is going to depend on how it is you present during the interview, and that is going to be something that's very important. The next kind of thing that we'll talk about has to do with kind of some businesses that are traditionally high risk, right? So the first one we're going to talk about is real estate businesses. Now, the reason, just before we kind of dive into the details, the reason that this can be a high risk E-2 visa category is because officers have this preconception that real estate is passive, right? So we do, and one thing I will say is we do get a lot of people who set up consultations with us, and they say, "I would like to buy a property and I would like to renovate it or rent it out, and I'm going to spend $500,000 or so on the property, or maybe even more. Can I apply for an E-2 visa?" And the crystal clear answer to that is no, you cannot, right? So because it's a passive investment, you actually don't even need a visa to do that. If you're in the US on some other type of visa, H-1B or TN or some other visa, and you wanted to do that, you could absolutely do it because it's a passive investment. It would be like buying stock in the stock market, right? I think that what ends up happening though is that the government, as soon as they hear real estate, they start to think that this is a passive investment that probably won't qualify for E2. So what I think that is important to do, if you do have the kind of different, we have listed here some different real estate ideas that could work, but I think that if you are doing kind of the property management or buying houses and fixing them up and renting them, et cetera, two things to consider. One is that you may want to position it as a home renovation business, right? So a business where you are going in, you're buying the tools, you're getting contractors, you're going in and you're renovating, renovating particular houses. Your investment is going to be a lot less because it's not going to have the inventory of the particular properties, but also it's going to take away that aspect of the passive nature because the government, if the government thinks that you just have a house and you're collecting rent, they're going to say that that's not really something that is going to require hiring full-time workers or hiring workers at all. The other thing to consider is if you are kind of doing this property management, because we have successfully done property management companies for people who don't have really any renovation component at all in their business model, but they have a lot of properties, right? So sometimes 30, 40, 50 properties. So it becomes very clear that the individual is actually going to need employees, right? So that's kind of so we move away from the investment being a passive investment to one where the investment or the business does actually require workers, because that's that is clear. If you look at even a residential building that rents out properties to individuals, and those residential buildings can have a full staff that work there, people who clean, people who are at the front desk, people who take out garbage, people in the office that are working, showing people the apartments to rent, people in administration that are handling the rent. So it definitely can, it can end up that it actually is a real business, because what E2 is always looking at is that the individual has a business, they've invested money, and they have the ability to create full-time jobs. Now, the other thing the other thing to consider, though, is what Dustin talked about earlier with respect to a substantial investment. If your business is a business which is buying and selling properties, then your substantial investment is going to be on the very high side, because you have to actually have some of those properties purchased, and there's a whole issue with seller financing. So it would be much better if those properties didn't have any type of mortgage on them. So that makes it more difficult. And then just you look at the list here of different types of real estate company ideas that can work. We've definitely done real estate brokerage firms. So someone who's selling real estate. There's some licensing things that people tend to have to make sure that they have worked out, but we've done a number of E2 visas for that. Real estate management companies, so that could be property management and or other. We talked about real estate renovation and construction companies. Again, here you want to make sure that you have a license. That's a kind of a common question that comes up when, especially if you're doing a USCIS filing, making sure that you have the proper license because usually it's a matter of just paying a fee, but you have the proper license to actually perform renovations and or do constructions on properties. And then we talk about house flipping. So that could work, but again, it can only work if it is on a much larger scale. So the other area that can be a high risk area for two reasons. And one reason is very similar to the last slide or last area, is that a company which is an equity or trading company. Now, we have done a number of E2s for this type of business, whether it's trading, whether it's a hedge fund or related types of company. So this would always be examples where someone is trading someone else's money. If someone's trading their own money, then that's not a business. They're that's not going to generally not going to work for an E2. But the reason that this particular area or this particular type of business sometimes comes under more scrutiny, has the same reason that it can be viewed as a passive form of investment, especially if the individual is trading their own money and maybe money of their family members, right? So if I think for this to move to rise to the level of business, we want to, because we all know that equity trading can be, large companies can be based completely on that. So it can definitely rise to the level of business, but you do want to show that you have investment and investment from other people, so that it isn't viewed as a passive investment. Now, the other thing to kind of keep in mind is that, I mentioned licensing with respect to the contractors, but contractors or renovations, but that's pretty easy licensing, right? Usually that's just going to a local municipality and paying a fee and getting the license. Like don't have to take tests and do different things like that. But licensing when it comes to equity trading, if you're trading your own, again, if you're trading your own investments, you don't need any license. You can do whatever you want because it's your money, right? But if you're trading other people's money, then the SEC and other regulatory bodies, state regulatory bodies, have requirements with respect to licensing. And so those are very important. So they're important, important from the perspective of E-2, because you're not going to get an E-2 approved if the business is not legal, right? So that's definitely something to keep in mind. It is a very highly regulated industry. And so that's something that you do have to keep in mind if you decide that you're going this route. So the other next topic really is the reasons E-2 visas get denied. So what's interesting, what I'm gonna do is I'm not gonna go in the order of the slide, because I think I'd like to pick out the main reason I think E-2 visas can get denied first. So from my perspective, the primary reason that E-2 visas get denied is because the individual has a business in their home country, and that particular business in the home country isn't doing that well or doesn't have any employees, right? So there's one case I can think of in London where the individual invested. He started an IT consulting company, and he had an IT consulting company in London for 15 years. And we warned him that this could be a big issue, and because he hadn't had employees ever, and then the company actually wasn't doing that well either. So and we of course don't put in the information in the file about the company not doing well, but when he went to the consulate, I guess a lot of that information is public record in the UK, and the officer had looked it up and presented him with the details of his business, and wouldn't approve the visa. And now the reason I started with this one is because I think it is a primary reason that E-2 visas can get denied. But the other bad thing about this reason, it is a very difficult reason to overcome. Like if you're denied for this particular reason, it is a very difficult reason to overcome. So a lot of the time, if you in contrast, for example, if you're denied because your investment amount is too low, because that's another, I think, reason that E-2 visas are denied, then you can, because when an E-2 visa is denied, we encourage people generally to reapply. There are only a couple of cases where we haven't encouraged the person to reapply, but we generally encourage them to reapply. Now, low investment amounts, easy one to overcome, because you just have to, easy to overcome if you have the money, you just spend more, right? You spend more, you get a CPA letter that says that you've spent everything that's required to get this particular business up and running. You at the end, then you reapply, and that's going to be relatively easy to overcome. So that's so those are two reasons. The other reason I think is important, which unfortunately is beyond your control, but it's probably in the top three, is your filing location, right? So, and then I say unfortunately it's not in your control, because you generally have to apply where you live, right? That's not always the case, but generally you have to apply where you live. And unfortunately, some consulates are much more difficult than others. And even a consulate that may not be that difficult, they may be difficult with respect to a particular thing, right? So even some consulates that have very, very high E-2 visa processing are not fond of service-oriented businesses at all, right? So if you live in one of those countries, and you are applying for an E-2, and even if you spent $50,000, $60,000, the consulate is going to be, not be fond automatically of the particular application, and really be looking for a way to deny it. Versus that exact same application, if it was in another venue, may come out just fine with the E-2 visa granted. So the venue is definitely important. Just go back just for 1 second, just a minute. Oh, so another kind of couple I wanted to point out is issues with the adjudicating officer. So cannot stress enough that this is not this isn't a power dynamic that is equal, you're on equal footing, right? So the officer can deny your application without any reason and tell you to go away. And unfortunately, there's no appeals process with E-2 visas. So we have seen cases where there was a case where an individual had what I thought was a very strong case, and went to the interview. And when he told me that he was denied, and I spoke to him, I said, "What happened?" And he was pretty rude to the officer, and that was based on how he described it. So, so that's not going to help you, right? And so generally, what we try to do is be polite, deferential, but then also, if it does look like it's not going that well, to try and find out exactly what it is that the officer didn't like. The other kind of thing that it happens, and this doesn't happen when you use a lawyer, but for people who don't use a lawyer, that they just aren't actually eligible at the time of filing. So whether it's they have seller financing, or there's something in their file that makes it, in some cases where it's absolutely obvious that they're not eligible. Even in some cases they're applying and they're not a treaty country, and that has not never happened with us, but that has happened to people where they've applied and their lawyer or their advisor didn't realize that the particular country had been removed from the list, because I think Bolivia has been removed and Ecuador has been removed. So, but people thought they were still on the list and applied, but they weren't even eligible. So that's another reason that people are denied. So the definitely COVID has impacted E-2 visa processing, but it's gotten better in most consulates. Unfortunately, though, it has not gotten better in all consulates. So there's still some consulates that are not processing E-2 visas, and have not since COVID. I think that even though things are getting better, there's still delays. Like even if you look at a consulate like Toronto, now you could probably get an interview in Toronto 2 to 3 months after you submit your application. But in the past, before COVID, it was 2 to 3 weeks, right? So Toronto does have a high volume of E-2s that they do, but I think it's steadily improving, steadily improving, but still I think something to watch out for. And I think that depending on the actual timing that when you submit your application, it may be necessary, if you want to continue operating your business, if you're in the United States, it may be necessary to file an extension of status. And again, depending on the types of delays at your particular consulate. And then when someone's and this is a conversation that you have to have with your immigration lawyer with respect to whether or not you should file using USCIS or file with a consulate. So USCIS has some benefits. One I mentioned earlier, that your investment amount can be a lot lower than with a consulate. The other is that some countries have very short periods of time that the visa can be issued for, so 3 months, and those people are really in the same position that someone that applies through USCIS is in. So that might be another reason someone wants to do USCIS. Sometimes when, during COVID, when there was a vaccine requirement, sometimes people would do USCIS filings because they did not want to get vaccinated. So there could be, but some as well just don't want to leave the country for fear of maybe not getting back in or something like that. But generally speaking, people apply at a consulate. They go to a consulate and apply. And the reason for that is that if you have a USCIS approval, then the first time that you leave the country, you do have to go to a consulate and apply for the visa. And it is applying from scratch. You're not going there and taking your approval notice and saying, "Give me a visa stamp." You are applying from scratch. So that's something that's a reason why primarily the majority of applications are done at a consulate. So the final thing I'll say is that The other reason sometimes over the last 2 years anyway, we've done a lot more USCIS applications, is because of the delays at consulates. So someone like, if you have a consulate that has a 3-4 month delay, even sometimes that's unacceptable to a client, because if they're buying a business, maybe the seller is not going to wait around for 3 or 4 months, or they want to get started faster. So there was a time when Toronto was taking a year to give an interview, right? So because of that, over the last few years, we've done a lot more USCIS applications, and the other thing with USCIS applications, they're more expensive. You have to pay the filing fee. When you do a USCIS application, you probably are going to have to premium process it. So even that is $2,500, and the filing fee $460. And then we, as a firm, charge more also to do a USCIS filing because it takes longer. And then the final thing I'll say about USCIS filing is that is only available if you have a source of funds that is, Dustin went over the source of funds requirement. If you have a source of funds requirement that kind of almost meets an audit standard, unfortunately. So there really is extensive review of where the money came from, and that can be a little bit of a problem sometimes, because people have complicated financial transactions that are occurring. So. Okay, so some issues or things that come up with respect to E-2. So let's just run through this list. Do you have to have employees before you start? So the answer to that is no. 80, probably 80 something percent of our clients don't have employees. Those are people who are starting a business. Certainly, it's helpful for the visa. It's very helpful for the visa if you do have an employee. And then also, if you're buying a business, you should have the business should have employees. Really, a good number is three employees. We talked already about USCIS filings and complicated source and trail of funds. When we do consular filing, with most consulates, it's not the case with all, but most consulates, we don't give them a lot of information on source of funds. We kind of rely on the individual being able to explain where the money came from during their interview, and then they can kind of bring documentation with them to support that that the source of funds is legitimate. So.
Perfect. Thank you, Ian. So now we are in our question and answer portion of this presentation. We do have a couple minutes before the hour's up. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to send them in. Looks like currently, Ian, I think you must have addressed all the questions that people had. So Ian, thank you so much for taking
Thank
the
you.
time to share your expertise. And to all of
Thank
you
you.
who participated, thank you for taking the time. Keep an eye out for our email where you can sign up for future webinars. We hope to see you soon.
Great. Thank you. Bye.